Tutaj to od razu...
Bardzo fajnie to wygląda, ja nie znałem. A, to już włączyłeś.
Tak, więc we are live with Professor Bruno Drweski, and I would like to remind everybody who listen us that Polish Workers' Party organized the march in the honor of the victims of the anti-communist bandits who killed more than 5,000 people in Poland after 1945. And we will speak about these bandits today. So, Bruno, let's go.
Yes, in fact, much more than 5,000, because you give 5,000. In fact, we have about 15,000 has been killed during as a repression from repression, action by anti-communist group in the years 1944, 1948, more or less. So it's 3 times 5,000. It's quite a lot, and it created an atmosphere. It was not really a civil war, since it didn't begin a irregular war, but it was something like an atmosphere of civil war at the end of Second World War and after. And in some region of the country, in the Lublin region, for example, or Rzeszów region, we can even say it was something very, very close to civil war, because the situation was there very hard. Not so in other regions of the country, but in those regions it was quite hard. How it did begin? In fact, of course, we have to come back to the Second World War, because during the Second World War we had, in fact, 3 main political camps in the underground. We must first understand the basic fact that the Nazi occupiers didn't look in Poland for collaborators, except of course they had people collaborating with the Gestapo and with repression, Nazi repression, but as individual. But they never tried to create any political structure collaborating with them, because at the beginning, at least, of the occupation, they planned the total destruction of Poland and of Polish nation. So they even didn't create any collaboration movement, even with the extreme right. And this situation created a very specific situation in Poland, because all the political spectrum was illegal, was in underground. So from the extreme left up to the extreme right, every political formation in Poland were illegal, and with this strong difference with other occupied country, that in Poland the extreme right, the Polish fascists, because they were fascists, Polish fascists were fighting against German, at least at the beginning of the war. And at the end, thing will change, but at the beginning of the war, they were in the resistance movement. And in fact, it created a situation, a politically not clear situation, because for a lot of people in the countryside, in little town, when you had somebody in the underground, basic people didn't ask if they were left, center, or right. Since they were underground, they were observed by people as, let's say, patriot, resisting against the German occupants. But in fact, of course, there was a strong difference. And in fact, during all the war, we had 3 main political groups in Poland. I mean, I'm talking about political and armed group, because each political group had its military formation. So we had the basic one, I would say, was the let's say the group that was linked with the government, the Polish government, who settled in France and then in England, and during the whole war. And let's say, the main political parties of the pre-war period, right-wing parties or left-wing parties, but center-left, were in this government. And in Poland, they created the underground political movement, which created an army which was later called Armia Krajowa, or let's say the country's army, which was divided politically between something like from the social democracy up to the, let's say, rightist nationalist. And apart from this mainstream, let's say, resistance movement, you had two other camps. The communist camp, which was in difficult situation at the beginning of the war, because the Communist Party of Poland was dissolved by the Comintern in 1938, and communist group existed throughout this period, but not as a united party. As a united party, they created the Polish Workers' Party in January 1942, and then from the rest of the war, they created the Armia Ludowa, the People's Army, who prepared People's Poland, which was founded in 1944. But on the other side of the political spectrum, on the extreme right, there were people that were not linked with the London Polish government, or not always linked. Sometimes they had contact, sometimes not. And it was the radical anti-communist extreme right, the Polish fascists. And they created different groups. The most, the well-known, the best known of them was the Narodowe Siły Zbrojne. It means the National Force Army, Armed Force, which was an underground movement, fighting, at least at the beginning of the war, fighting against Germans, but also from the very beginning of the war, they were fighting communists and every leftist, which they were thinking that they were too near with communists. Even some militants of the Socialist Party linked with the Polish London government, which was an anti-communist government, but some of these socialists were killed by the far right as communists, even if they were not communists. In the same time, I told you they were fascists, and as fascists, they were, of course, anti-Semitic. So a lot of Jews were killed by them. And when I told that they were fighting German, I told they were fighting German because they were not fighting Nazism. They were fighting German. Communists were fighting Nazis, but they were fighting German. So their fascism was an anti-German fascism, but it was a fascism, a Polish fascism, an ultra-nationalist Polish fascism, which was against Germans, but not against Nazism. For according to them, their point of view was that Hitler is right for the German, but the German are the enemy of Poland. So we have to fight against German because they are German. But the ideology Hitler has is good for German. And Poles have to create a, let's say, a Polish Hitler. And that would be very good, because every nation needs to have the same goal, to create a pure, racially pure, ethnically pure nation. And nations are fighting each other, which is normal according to their social Darwinism ideology. But basically, they consider that Hitler was the best German it can be. He can be. Mussolini is the best Italian he can be. And NSZ, the Polish National Armed Force, are the best Poles they can be. That in every in every country, a very good nationalist must fight against communists, against leftists, against Jews, which were assimilated to communism according to their ideology of so-called Judeo-Bolshevism. And that, in spite of that, every nation have to compete one with the other. So Poles are in contradiction with German, but it's normal that every nation are fighting one against the other. And that's why they were anti-German, but they were not anti-Nazi. In fact, they accepted the same ideology as Nazi in Germany, but they thought that they were, let's say, Polish Nazi. With this slight difference, formal difference, that according to them, the basic identity of Poles was not the neo-paganism as in Germany, but it was a national Catholicism. So a Catholicism rebuilt in a non-universal religion, but as a, let's say, I would say as a tribal religion of the Poles. Except of that, of course, they were politically and socially and economically reactionary. They were in favor of private property, but they were in favor of the so-called national private property. So they could accept some, let's say, social reform if this social reform was directed against a foreigner in Poland, but not against a Polish owner. So their ideology was basically anti-communist. And during the Second World War, quite a lot of these groups attacked communists during the German occupation. In some region, it was even theorized in the fact that in the Kielce region or in the Lublin region, you had leaflets from them telling that we must first kill all communists, and when we will have finished with communists, then we will fight Germans. So it was quite clear that for them the worst enemy were the communists, Polish communists, of course, and then the Germans. In other regions, they fought against German, but in the same time, they were attacking communists and they were also killing Jews. And that's the basic problem you don't have in other European occupied country, except Ukraine, where you had extreme right that can fight against German occupants under patriotic let's say, slogans, but in the same time killing communists and leftists, not only communists, all left, but especially communists, of course, but not only, and in the same time being aggressively anti-Semitic. We have quite a lot of examples of Jews who fled from cities to forests, and when they arrived in forest where there was this band of fascists, they were killed. Same thing, of course, for communists, and same thing for every people considered as communists. At the end of the Second World War, when the German occupation began to finish, when the Soviet army was near Polish borders, some of the leaders of this formation of the NSZ began to carry on negotiation with Germans, and they even collaborated with German, not only passively, but I would say actively. And that's the reason why the most well-known formation, military formation of this underground NSZ, which is called the Brigada Świętokrzyska, which was in the center of Poland, retreated with the German army under the protection of the German army in Poland, then in Czechoslovakia, and after they went on the American side when when the American army arrived there in Czechoslovakia, in western Czechoslovakia. So that's the point with the NSZ. And what we have to take into account with the NSZ, it is also the fact that since they were from the very beginning anti-communists, they managed to create an underground organization and a military organization that was able to survive after German left Poland, because they already had all the underground structure. So the Soviet army and Soviet security forces couldn't, at the beginning at least, couldn't penetrate them and and destroy them. So that's why this extreme right anti-communist underground was not so important, let's say, as the anti-communist, let's say, center force or center right or center left force, but they were much more organized, much better organized, and after the war they were much more efficient in the fight against the new Poland. In the same time, of course, the, let's say, center, the mainstream pro-London government resistance was, of course, also anti-communist, but it was a little bit divided between left and right, and they didn't had a very consequent policies against communists or against Soviet Union, depending on local situation. In some places, their formation were fighting against Soviet partisans, for example. In other places, they were collaborating with Soviet partisans. In some places, they collaborated with Polish communists, in other not. So it was a little bit more unclear, let's say. And this, because of course the social base of this group were very divided, and this explains why at the end of the Second World War this organization has to be dissolved by the most anti-communist leader of this organization, so they can rebuild a new organization, much more anti-communist, which was called WIN, which is Wolność i Niepodległość. It means liberty and independence, which was only a part of the occupation time anti-German pro-London government organization, and but this organization was much weaker, because since they were built out of the pre-existent organization, people were knowing them. So from all the time from 1944 to 1948, they couldn't really organize easily, and they were much it was much easier, excuse me, for the NKVD or for the Polish state security bureau to repress them, since inside this organization you had people which were not so convinced of the anti-communism as it was in the extreme right. And this situation was so mixed that, of course, the WIN also carried on quite a lot of sabotage against the new regime. They collaborated, and now we know that they received money from United States, from CIA and Western powers, but they were not so well organized. They were penetrated by the state security, and now it's obvious. I mean, everybody knows it's an objective fact. In 1948, the WIN was taken under control of the MBP, the Ministry of State Security, and it began, in fact, an organization that was supposed to be anti-communist, but that was manipulated from by the state security used by the state security to send to West false informations, to collect money from the West, arriving to Poland and taken by the government. And we can say that Wien from 1948 is objectively a pro-government organization, even if, of course, the mass of its members were thinking they are fighting against communists, but they were used, in fact, by communists. And that was a very big success of the state apparatus to have taken the control of their enemy in the Wien. But the situation, of course, was much more different with the NSZ. The NSZ was up to the end a strongly anti-communist, well-organized, terroristic organization, killing not only after 1944, they were not only killing, let's say, communists, but they could kill, for example, peasants that took land from the land reform. They killed people, people working, let's say, at the town hall. Even if these people were not communists, they killed teachers in the schools, and every people which were working, let's say, for the official People's Poland government. But of course, their ultra-nationalist slogans were not popular in the majority of Poles. Of course, we cannot say that in 1944 or 1945 the majority of Poles were communists. For sure, they were not. But the majority of Poles in 1944 and 1945, they wanted basically, let's say, three things. Peasants wanted land, and the communists gave them land. Due to the land reform. They wanted peace after a long and very hard war. And communists proposed them fight until the victory in May 1945 and the end of the war. And they wanted the rebuilding of the country, which was completely destroyed. And the communists, of course, began to organize the reconstruction of the country. But the anti-communist underground, what were they promising? What were they proposing to Poles? To have a new war against Soviet Union, not to rebuild the country, but to rebuild it when the victory against Soviet will be done. And their main slogan was that American will earlier or later have a war with Soviet Union, and we will fight on the side of American, and then Poland will be free, and etc., etc. But in this situation, there was also another question which was very important in Poland, and which was a very good argument for the government, not only for communists, but for a lot of people which were on the side of the government for other reasons. The first reason was that Poland had, after the Potsdam Treaty in June 1945, Poland received the land taken from Germany, which were more or less 1/3 of Poland territory. And it was, of course, obvious that if a war between the West and Soviet Union begin, this former German land will go back to German, because the West Germany were on the side of United States and later NATO. And on the other side, in the east of Poland, of course, you had Soviet Union, but you had also what we call the Ukrainian nationalists from the Ukrainian insurgent army, the UPA, and these were Ukrainian fascists. And these Ukrainian fascists collaborated more or less during the war with Germans, but later they collaborated with Americans. So it was very clear for a lot of Poles that if there is a war between American and Soviet Union, Poland will not get back its territory annexed to Soviet Union, but this territory will belong to the new independent Ukraine. And in the same time, Poland will lose the territory that Poland received after the Second World War, after the Potsdam Treaty against Germany. So Poland will be very, very little, a very tiny country. And it was obvious that for a Polish patriot, even if he was anti-communist, but a real patriot, it was obvious that a war against Soviet Union would be a war against Polish interests due to this border problems in West and East. But in the same time, on the eastern border of Poland, you had, the border was, of course, drawn in area which were mixed Polish Ukrainians, and you had Ukrainians on Polish side and Poles on the Ukrainian side, mixed, of course, with people of the other nationality. And that's why at the end of the war, the UPA, the Ukrainian insurgent army, was taking advantage of the situation of three borders, the border between Soviet Union, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. And of course, they were attacking on one side and then retreating on the other side. And of course, it was very difficult to fight against them because they were using it was a mountain territory, and they were attacking on Soviet side, then retreating on Polish side. And when Polish army arrived, they were retreating on Czechoslovak side and coming back on Soviet side, and so on and so on. So the UPA existed as an underground army up to 1952. And not in 1952, the last underground regiment of the UPA was destroyed. So it was a quite important army, very well organized, but because it was organized during the Second World War, first under German protection, and it was a very well organized army. And the Polish extreme right, the NSZ, which were basically anti-communist, even if the UPA had killed a lot of Poles during the war, civilian Poles. I'm not talking about politics. I'm just talking about nationalist and racist murders. Even because, in spite of that, the NSZ and even the Wien also, who I told you earlier, this formation were in the southeastern Poland collaborating with the UPA against communists. And so their anti-communism was stronger than the fact that their fellow citizens were killed by those, let's say, Ukrainian anti-communists during the Second World War. And, this fanatism, of course, couldn't create among Poles a strong sympathy. And that's one of the reasons the People's Poland, after all, existed. It means, as I told you, a lot of Poles were not communists in 1944 or 1945. But very, very quickly, a lot of Poles, non-communists, had the choice between communists and their allies and extreme right. And the choice was very easy to do for the reason I told you. And so, and especially it was very easy to do in the countryside where peasants received land from the land reform. So when the fascists decided to fight against the communists, quite a lot of peasants were collaborating with the Polish militia, which is the police, or with the KBW, Korpus Bezpieczeństwa Wewnętrznego. It means the internal army against the army that is directed on internal front. And because of that, I think that at the end we had two situations. We had the situation in 1947. The government, the Polish People's Government, decided that it can offer amnestia to the people on the underground who wants to join, to renounce to underground activity. And the estimation we have now is that about 70,000 people which were in the underground decided to go to the militia, recognize they were in the underground, and go home and say they don't. They leave the underground and they just want to live as a peaceful citizen. So at that moment, there was only left in the underground about 10 to 15,000 people who stayed there in the underground. And what happened is that at the end of the war, they had quite a lot of reserve. They had quite a lot of arms. They had quite a lot of food. Later, they received money, dollar from West. But the more the situations were stabilized, the less they received money, especially because the Polish state apparatus succeeded in proving that the Americans were funding underground, which is of course completely illegal, and the American had to resign from this activity because it was well known, it was worldly known, and at the end this underground movement couldn't have any more resources, and they began, they changed from, let's say, terrorist political activity to open banditism. They just fought to have something to eat, something to take from people, and little by little they disappeared. Because, at the end of the war, the country was completely disorganized. So it was quite easy in 1946, 1947, 1948 to be active in such underground organization, let's say in Eastern Poland, to grab what you can grab, and then to go to the west of Poland, where the administration was still not really reorganized, and to disappear them, to change name, to take a new identity card, and to forget about political activity. But of course, with the money you had grab in bank or in just like bandits, and it became a mafia organization at the end that, let's say, emigrated in Western Poland after having stolen what they could in Eastern and Central Poland. So that's why, more or less, the history of this underground, which pretended to have political objective at the beginning and patriotical objective, but at the end it became just a criminal organization, which were Wien and NSZ destroyed more or less in 1948, 1949. Except we have to take, there is one exception. In Central Poland, there was a little group of NSZ who existed up to 1963. and they were arrested in 1963 in forest in central Poland. But it is the last remnant of that underground organization, let's say, already destroyed at the end of the 40s, let's say. You had also, I have to mention also another type of underground in Western Poland, the former German territories. You had an organization, a little organization created by Himmler at the end of the war, that is called Werwolf, which was an underground organization created by the Nazis when they saw the victory of Soviet Union. They planned to organize something underground behind Soviet lines, and in Lower Silesia, in Polish Silesia, they created the section of what is called the Werwolf, which was active in the 1945, 1946, and then disappeared when Germans were expelled from Poland. They disappeared and ceased to exist. But we have to also to take into account that when we talk about extreme right underground in Poland at the end of the Second World War, we had the main one, which was a Polish extreme right, but we had in the east of Poland also the Ukrainian extreme right, and in the west of Poland we had also a German extreme right. Yeah, so.
Okay. Bruno, could you make something with the no? Oh, so first question, which I want to ask you, is: could you explain for the viewers who don't know history of Poland the difference between the two kinds of Polish fascism? Because 2-3 years before the war, we have in Poland really we have the ruling guy. His name was Rydz Śmigły, and he was
the government.
Yes, his government also was inspired by the Hitler, but in the same time, Rydz Śmigły and his people, they sent this fascist from the Endecja from the ONR to the prison.
So because because we have to understand a specificity of Polish situation dating back from the 19th century. In Poland, not only nationalism, but all the, let's say, national or patriotic movement was divided in two main geopolitical orientation. It means who is the main enemy of Poland. Some patriots and nationalists were thinking that the worst enemy is Russia. At that time, Tsarist Russia, but later it would be Soviet Union. And you had people who were thinking that the worst enemy is Germany, Prussia, then Germany, then, of course, a Third Reich. This divide you had also, and especially in the right movement and in the extreme right. That's why the Polish government, after the end, because Piłsudski was not a fascist. Piłsudski was an authoritarian guy, that's of course, but he was against any form of, let's say, ethnic nationalism. According to his theory, every Polish citizen, if he's loyal to the state, of course, the question, what is a loyal citizen, is complicated. But anyway, if he's a loyal citizen, he can be a Jew, he can be an Ukrainian, he can be a Pole, and everything is okay, as he supports the state. But after the death of Piłsudski in 1935, the regime was more and more authoritarian and less legitimate. So they began to take examples from, let's say, so-called example from different European dictatorship, especially the Italian one and later the German one. And the mainstream, the government was rather, and Rich you told about, they were not, let's say, tough fascists, but they were convinced that some fascist methods are efficient, let's say, and they were also thinking that since, from their point of view, Soviet Union, Russia, and then Soviet Union is the worst enemy of Poland, then Poland has to, let's say, find a way of cooperation with Germany and then with the Third Reich. And of course, they developed this policy up to 1939. In 1939, they discovered that Hitler didn't cared about Poland, but that's another thing. Up to 1939, they were quite collaborating with Germany, and they were thinking that with the alliance of Germany, they will have a secure state and guarantee power, and so on and so on. And of course, they managed to organize within the Polish regime different groups coming from the fascists, from the extreme right, especially some people from the ONR, which is the National Radical Movement, one of the fascist movement existing then. Of course, they accepted different forms of fascist groups within their own government structures. But on the other side, the old Polish nationalist right, which was traditionally anti-German from the 19th century, they were all the time anti-German. And Drweski, one of the leader of this Polish camp, he was always anti-German. But he was fascinated by fascists, by Italian fascists in the 20s, and later by German fascism, it means by Nazism, just that he was still anti-German. And he was always telling that what the Germans are doing with Nazis is an example of what Poles should do. But of course, the Germans are an enemy. So we have to admire that enemy, to take what they are creating positive for their nation, according to Drweski, of course, and to do that in Poland. But Poland has to fight Germany, because Germans are the real dangers. And it was very, he was to a certain extent even consequent with himself, because before the World War, the First World War, he always advocated alliance of Poland with Russia, the Tsarist Russia at that time. But when Soviet Union was created, of course, he was a radical anti-communist. But in the same time, he wrote that Polish patriots have to fight in a fanatical way against communism at home. But in the same time, Polish nationalists should collaborate with Soviet Union, because it's Russia, against Germany. Because on geopolitical level, Moscow is should be our ally against Germans, even if the ideology in Moscow is the bad one and the ideology in Berlin is the good one. But Drweski died in January 1939, and during the Second World War, the party he created switched on anti-communist, anti-communist they were always, but anti-Soviet also, because they, of course, they just one moment. Because yes, I forgot to close my phone. So so they in some extreme right in Poland, you had a strong anti-Soviet feelings, but not because they changed the mind of Drweski, but because they knew that if the Soviet army arrives in Poland, of course, there will be land reform and social reform they cannot support. And because of class reason, they began to fight also against Soviet Union. But the fact that they fought Soviet Union, they fought communist, doesn't change the fact that they were also against Germans. But of course, this difference in Polish fascism is important, because some fascists were on the side of the Polish government before the Second World War, and some Polish fascists were against and were repressed and arrested, and they were even in the concentration camp of Bereza Kartuska. Of course, the repression of the Polish government in the pre-war period was mostly against Polish communists, but it was also against Polish and Ukrainian fascists. Not so importantly than the communists, but they were also repressed.
Yes, but they were also the Polish fascists who collaborated with Gestapo and this
Brigada Świętokrzyska. The NSZ collaborated, but at the end of the war, at the beginning of the war, they were rather fighting Germans. As I told you, there were at the beginning of the war, the Poles collaborating with Gestapo were rather individuals that for different reasons collaborated, but no organization accepted any collaboration. Even there is a tiny group which was created around a pre-war writer who is called Skifsky. He was pro-German, he was pro-Nazi, and after the German occupation began, he proposed German to create something like a Polish, let's say, Polish government collaborating with Germans. But German didn't want that, because German had no plan of any form of state or political collaboration with Poles. They just accepted individual collaboration with Gestapo, but as individuals. But when German army began to be defeated in 1943 and especially 1944, then of course the Germans began to accept some form of official collaboration, or let's say organizational collaboration, with a strongly anti-communist organization in Poland. Earlier, they just accepted collaboration on the local ground with individuals. This individual could be linked with the Polish extreme right, and you have people from the extreme right that denounced communists to the Gestapo, but I would say that they did it as individuals, since the Gestapo didn't collaborate at that time with any Polish organization. They collaborated eventually with individuals, but not with organization. At the end of the war, some forms of let's say regular collaboration began. Because the German had to, had to find the more allied they could to prevent them from defeat. So they tried to find some Polish collaboration, and they had, especially the so-called, as I told you earlier, the Brigada Świętokrzyska, which was the strongest extreme right formation in Poland, and which officially had an agreement with German army and German occupation group. But that's in 1944, and I would say it's for purely tactical reason, because they had to find every ally they can. But I'm pretty sure that if they would have won the war, they would have killed these Poles as other Poles they were killing. For the German, any Slav was an enemy. Even if it was an extreme right Slav, it still was a Slav. But of course, for Polish anti-communists at the end of the war, but as I told you, even at the beginning of the war, for anti-communists, Germans were less enemy than communists. Germans were enemies for them, but a second enemy. First enemy were communists and Jews. According to them, of course.
I wanted to remind this organization who organized the killing Jews in the 1940, in the time of the Wielkanoc, Eastern.
Which organization?
Pogrom Wielkanocny.
Yeah, but it's not an organization. It was more or less organized.
Narodowa Organizacja Radykalna.
I don't Narodowa Organizacja Radykalna, but yeah, but it was linked with the. It was a, let's say, it was a. It was not a real organization. It was fascist, but they were not let's say legal fascists. They were just German created killing groups. Like you had the Policja Granatowa, like you had the Policja Żydowska, the Jewish police. Of course, as I told you, the German created some collaboration. I told on individual level. Sometimes it could be on a more organized level, but always on local level. You had also another organization from the extreme right, which was linked with Gestapo, not officially, of course, but linked with the Gestapo. It was Miecz I Pług. It means Miecz I Pług, sword and I don't know how you say pług in English. I forgot. It's an agricultural peasant tool anyway. But it's obvious this organization also was almost a creation of the Gestapo. It was not a Polish organization who joined the German. It was a Gestapo created organization for some Poles linked with the Gestapo, which is another, which was the level of collaboration the Nazi accepted.
Okay, you said that Polish anti-communist bandits, they collaborated with the UPA.
Yes.
Could you say something about the politics of the UPA in 1943 in Wołyń?
That's absolutely terrible. I mean, even the Germans were disgusted by what they saw, because, the German most often they killed, but the UPA, what they did, it's torture you cannot imagine. For example, they opened bellies, and people had to march against around a pole, and their belly was going out, or they raped pregnant woman, and then they took the baby out of the belly and killed in front of the mother, and then killed the mother, or pushed the people in the fire. What they did is a barbarism which is unimaginable. I mean, I think that the UPA was one of the most barbarian fascist organization in the world. I would say that even the SS did what the UPA was able to do. We have, the estimation is that in Volhynia, it means in Western Ukraine, they killed about from 80,000 to 100,000 Poles, not taking into account, of course, that they were killing also Jews and Czechs, because you had Czechs in Volhynia. And of course, they were killing also every Ukrainian that was not collaborated with them. And the Poles of Volhynia, when they could, they went to the forest, and in the forest they had two possibilities. I mean, they had no choice. They went in the nearest forest they can, but in some forests you had Polish partisans, in other forests you had Soviet partisans. But anyway, for them, the Soviet or the Polish partisans were the only way to survive. And quite a lot of time, Polish partisans, even if they were anti-communist, collaborated with Soviet partisans against Ukrainian nationalism, which was so terrible that even Polish anti-communists preferred Soviet partisan to Ukrainian nationalists. And that's why, what I told earlier, that's why, and this happened in 1943. So that's why the fact that in 1944 and 1945, Polish extreme right accepted to collaborate with this UPA 1 year or 2 years later was an element, it was completely unimaginable, unbearable for a lot of Poles that this extreme bandits, not even bandits, I mean, it was much worse than banditism. It was this sadistic, ultra sadistic beasts, I don't know how to call them, were collaborated with the NSZ or with the Wien, for example, in Hrubieszów. The military commando of the Wien was attacking the city in collaboration with UPA in 1945 or 46, I don't remember. And you know, some such thing was unbearable for, I mean, whoever, whatever political opinion you have, you can be even strongly anti-communist, but the fact to see Polish anti-communists collaborating with such beasts as the UPA, it was ununderstandable. And but in fact, it helped to make a lot of Poles conscious of what is the so-called anti-communist resistance movement, which was degenerating at a level unimaginable 2 or 3 years earlier. And in a certain sense, we can say, yeah, it was a good thing because it made clear people that anti-communism is a form of fanatism that is completely irrational, because there is nothing rational in it. I mean, you can understand why people are not communist after all. It's logical for class reason and so on. But at a certain point, anti-communism become completely irrational. So irrational that you cannot accept it, even if you are anti-communist. And that's why quite a lot of people from anti-communist background began to, let's say, to accept the new Poland, because this choice between an unbearable opposition and the communist camp was obvious to every rationally thinking Pole. and that's why one of the arguments, for example, of the let's say Gomułka, which was the head of the Polish Workers' Party at the end of the war. He was a communist, of course. He was also minister of the so-called recovered territories. It means the minister of the territory that were taken from Germany. And he organized his ministry with specialists that were during the war, during the occupation, that were working in the underground, in the anti-communist underground, in the AK, Armia Krajowa, Delegacja Rządu. It means the delegation of the London government. But these people in 1945, they were working during the war to plan the annexation of these territories to Poland. Of course, to the capitalist Poland. But when it happened the socialist Poland, they joined socialist Poland because they thought maybe it's socialist Poland, but still it's Poland, and we worked for the Polonization of this former German territory. So we will work for the new government because he's working in the interest of the nation. Even if we're not communist, we are patriot, and they are doing the good job. So they worked for Gomułka. Which was the chief of the Communist Party at that moment, but also minister, and they were let's say collaborating with the new Polish government to rebuild the country. And in the same time, these people were on the killing list of the extreme right, who considered them as traitors. Traitors, of course, to the anti-communism, but they were not traitors to Poland. They were Polish patriots, in fact. So you saw quite a lot of people. Rzepecki, who was the first leader of the WIN, which is the anti-communist underground, when he was arrested by the state apparatus, the state security apparatus. And in prison, he changed his mind, and he began to collaborate with the new government. And he decided, and he launched appeal to his fellow, let's say, fellow comrades from the right wing to join the government and to rebuild the country. So you see then that that even within anti-communists, you had people which were more or less rationally thinking, that began to change their mind, and the pure irrationals began more and more criminals and less politics in the same time. And that's something very, very interesting. I mean, on the historical point of view, the degeneration of some political formations when they are, let's say, out of the mainstream of history. And the mainstream of history after the Second World War was socialism. If you fight against socialism in Poland in 1945, you have earlier or later to be irrational, because rationally, socialism was rebuilding the country. Rationally, socialism was building a new industry. Rationally speaking, socialism was promoting masses of people to education, to science. So every rationally thinking Pole in 1946 or 1947 couldn't be anti-communist. I mean, he could be anti-communist, but he must recognize that the communists are doing the job he wanted to be done for the country. And for the big majority of the society, especially the peasants and the workers.
Okay. Now I want to ask. I want to ask you about. I want to finish with the history.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the politic of the Polish government, and could you explain this evolution? Because when I was in the school in the 1990s, they teach us only about Armia Krajowa.
Yes.
Armia Krajowa, Warsaw Uprising, and in this time they didn't say any word about these cursed soldiers. It was starting in the, I think, in the first government of the peace in 2005. Mm-hmm. And this question is very complicated for the geopolitical reasons. You said about this question that the anti-communists from Poland collaborated with UPA, which was understandable. It was impossible to understand for the Poles. How it is possible that Polish people collaborated with UPA? But today we have, for example, situation that Poland wants to collaborate with the opposition in the Belarus, with the Madame Cichanowska.
Yeah.
And at the same time, one time the Premier Minister of Poland, Morawiecki, and President Duda, they honored the Bury, Rice Bury, one of these bandits who killed many people only because they are Orthodox, only because they are Belarusian. Yeah. And in the same time, they invite Cichanowska and say, we are on your side, we supporting Belarusian. And other example is that Morawiecki and Duda, they said a lot of good things about the Brigada Świętokrzyska, which killed a lot of Jews. And in the same time, they ask question, why now Poland have bad relations with the Israel? So could you explain this evolution?
Because there is on one side there is geopolitics, and on the other side there is let's say ignorance. Of course, the politician you told about, Morawiecki and so on, they are not ignorant. They are pure cynics. But they know that a lot of young Poles don't know history of what happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and so on. So, but they know also that young Belarusians don't know either, and that most openly, most Jews in Israel don't know either, because capitalism is destroying science, destroying culture, destroying education, and young generations are uneducated on historical, political, sociological ground. So, so what they need is to have an enemy. Because in 1920s, in 1990s, as you saw when you were young, the Polish government had to pretend he is, let's say, liberal democrat. So if he is liberal democrat, he has to promote the Poles that were fighting for Polish government in England and that were fighting for England and United States. That's quite logical. So, of course, then they were promoting AK, they were promoting the center-right resistance movement, the mainstream one. But now situation has changed. I mean, now social situation for a lot of young Poles is very bad. A lot of Poles had to immigrate to find work outside their country. And in this situation, what you can do? You must have an enemy. You must have an enemy, because if situation is bad and it's supposedly not your fault, it's the fault of an enemy. Actually, the enemy cannot be Germany because it's an allied in NATO and European Union. Of course, it cannot be Czechia, it cannot be Slovakia, it cannot be Lithuania because they are all in NATO, they are all in European Union. It cannot be Israel because Israel is also on the same side. So, who can be the enemy you will excite people against? Communists and Russians. That's the only way.
Belarusians.
And of course Belarusians, because they are let's say linked with Russia, or supposedly linked with Russia. And of course in Poland, especially Belarusians, the Belarusian minority is very bad, because this minority is always considered, and to a certain extent it's objective. It's a minority which is rather leftist oriented. For historical and cultural reasons, and because of that, in Belarusia they will support the anti-Lukashenko, anti-Russian, anti-communist opposition, but in the same time they will support in Poland the Polish extreme right, who was killing Belarusians, because these Belarusians were rather on the side of communists. And of course, it's not logical. But when young Polish people don't know history, it's quite easy to mix everything and to make a hero of Buri in Białystok, and in the same time to make hero of anti-communism the Belarusians who were fighting on the side of Germans, because there were such Belarusians. Of course, a strong minority, a little minority, but still a minority, but still they were. The one who are waving the red, white flag we saw on the last demonstration in Minsk was the flag the collaborators of Nazis in Belarus were using during the Second World War. And this flag was introduced during the first German occupation in 1918. So it's a purely German Belarusian flag from the First World War and from the Second World War. But anyway, who knows about that? When you ask young Belarusian about this flag, they say, "Oh, it's the national flag," and they don't know it's the German occupation flag. And in Poland, it's the same. The young Polish people, they don't know about that. And in Israel, it's the same. I mean, they were brought up in a nationalist ideology against Arab socialism, against Soviet Union, against communism, against everything. So they don't know that anti-communists in Poland were anti-Semitic. For them, the enemy is the communists, not the anti-Semitic right. It's a question of decay of culture, education, and so it's very easy now to mix everything and to tell young people that Russia is bad, Belarus is bad. The Belarusian government, of course, is bad, and communists are bad. And communists, Russian, Belarusian, it's the same. So we have to fight against them. And everybody who fought against are good. And when you ask, and the German Nazi, they were fighting, they were good, say, "Oh, no, the Nazi were not good, but we have to understand because there was a revolution in Germany, some people became Nazi because they didn't want it to be communists," and so on and so on. So every time it's the communists that are the bad guys. And even the Nazi were not so bad. They were bad, but not so bad. And the UPA I told about, you ask people, they did all this massacre. Yes, they did this massacre, but you have to understand the local situation and so on. And they explain what is unbearable to accept. Because how can you justify the killing of a little baby? Just because he's a Polish baby or a Jewish baby. There is no rational answer, but they are not rational. Morawiecki, Duda, Kaczynski, all these people, they use just feelings, emotion, but they lose at every time you put the debate on a rational level. because they have no argument then.
Okay, the last question which I want to ask is about the Polish left from the party Razem, together in English. So we can't say that they don't know history, because
Yes.
the leader of this party is the doctor of the history. And when I was a student, I made I make lesson with him. So
and he was a good lesson or a bad one?
I was the only one who was prepared for the lessons, so he couldn't give me one, but he tried. But I was the only one who was prepared always, because it was the history of the social history. No, it was interesting. But I want to ask about the cult Razem of the one of the anti-communist bandits, which name is Witold Pilecki. He was a hero in the time of the war. He was somebody who go to the Auschwitz to make the report for the Americans, and he make them their good job. But after the war, he became he continued his struggle against the new Poland, new socialist Poland, and against Soviet Union. He started to organize the terrorist organization who wanted to make the terrorist attacks. We have the similar example in Norway, the guy which name is Breivik, who also wanted to kill the people only because they are leftist. So this Pilecki, he was arrested by the Polish police. He was sentenced because he wanted to make a terrorist organization who killed the leftists in Poland, and he was killed.
And he was now executed.
Yes, he was executed. Yes. But I can understand why leftist organization like Razem, they now think that Pilecki, who wanted killing Polish leftists, he was a hero.
Because for right-wing social democrats, because I would say Razem is objectively, historically, he's taking the side of right-wing social democrats. And right-wing social democrats were fighting not only against communists, they were fighting against the official PPS, the PPS of Osóbka-Morawski, the PPS of Cyrankiewicz, the PPS of Rapacki. All these people who were ministers or president after the Second World War, they were not communists, they were socialists. But they were socialists on the side of communists, on the same side as communists. And these socialists were fought by the PPS WRN, which was called the Polska Partia, the Polish Socialist Party, Liberty, Equality, Independence, WRN.
Yes.
Anyway, the right wing of the socialists were fighting against communists, but also against left wing communists, socialists. And I would say Zandberg and Razem most obviously choose the right wing of the socialist tradition and not the left wing of the socialist tradition. That's all what I can say. But I mean, I'm not surprised, because if you look at their social program is a center-left program. It's not a radical left. It's called radical left in Poland because the SLD is so right-wing that Razem looks a little bit more left. But, when everything is right, when you are slightly not right, you are left, but it's not left. Razem is just it's just a fake left, But it's a created left. It's a left created by the European Union, by the European Commission, by the German foundations, supposedly left. But it's not a grassroots Polish left movement, first, because without foreign money, it would never have been developed. That's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, they cannot be on the side of the radical left, the radical socialist left of Poland, because the left socialists in Poland were in favor of nationalization of industry, and they are against. They are for private industry. So how can they be on the side of Osóbka Morawski or Rapacki or Cyrankiewicz? They are on the side of Pilecki and Ciołkosz, which is logical. So of course, the problem is that they are called radical left. That's the problem. They should be called right-wing left.
Okay, it was genial what you say about Russia. So I think that the next time we have to speak about more about the situation, Polish situation, Polish political situation. So today we can finish. I will shut this recording.